So what I'm going to present today is essentially I will first give a basic introduction here to the background and then motivation of this research, why we somehow started to work on this problem a couple years ago, and then I will introduce a optimization model to identify actually the least resilient or the most vulnerable network. Okay, and then, well, possibly I won't have enough time to talk about this this method, the technical perspective. Actually, we have tried different algorithms like alternative update methods, and then we have also based on active asset methods, and then we also introduce some new methods when these classical optimization methods that don't work. Okay, how to deal with this, and then we will try to categorize the optimality conditions. Okay, from the solution identified by using this, sort of I would say integrated methods which combines several optimization methods. Okay, and essentially he'll try to use this optimal condition to sort of categorize what's the network structure in that case. Okay, and then once we identify this network structure here, then we look at here that cascading effect in this network. Okay, and also I will present some numerical result to demonstrate the contagious risk and a domino effect in this in the least resilient network. Okay, and then we will conclude this presentation by discussing some potential future work. Okay, and to start here, it's the financial network. I would say it's really consists of all these financial institutions where actually they do business with each other. Sometimes, for example, they may invest in the same startup company, or the same portfolio, similar kind of. So they do have some, connection here. Okay, so the growing in the connectivity between the banks or financial institutions, definitely it has a lot of benefits pushing that. That's actually, there's a huge push in the last 20 years and in this direction here. The purpose is definitely to speed up the whole business process here and save the cost. But on the other hand, it also has been observed if we really work with several institutions, sometimes may help to diversify the risk. Okay, and of course, and we all know that there's no free lunch in this world. If there are some really benefits in doing so, then there potentially some setback. Okay, the downside of this growing connectivity is really the continuous risk, which means essentially if a single bank failed or bankrupted, and then that failure will spread to the whole network very quickly. Okay, that's what is called the systemic risk. Okay, and we have seen this in the financial crisis here in 2007, 2008. It started with Lehman Brothers here, and then later on, countries, and then got in big trouble, and then Portugal and Greece and Italy and Spain. Okay, and then many other countries. Pretty much, I would say, most countries got involved in the big trouble during that financial crisis here. So as you can see, and from these two figures here, and the figure in the left-hand side, and you can see here, we have USA and China, Australia here. Somehow, mainly it's actually the cause here is from the subprime effect here, but then on the right-hand side, and then we try to use other ways to visualize different mitigation strategies adopted by different countries to control that risk. Okay, and then we have bailout. Okay, and nationalization. Okay, and then or somehow the government provide a deposit guarantee for the debt for all these financial institutions. Okay, and then you can see pretty much almost similar here. You think of the nationalization here or deposit guarantee. It's essentially eventually all the government, they have to say, okay, I will take care of the debt for all these financial institutions. They also implement certain monetary policies like interest rate cut, okay, and some others, okay, and also enhance sort of the ratio between the asset and the liability ratio. Okay, there's a lot of policies have been implemented, okay, to control the risk. And here is just in comparison list of works in this area. Possibly the most important work is really it's the paper by Esberg and Noel, published in Management Science in 2001, actually, which start talking about here systemic risk in financial systems. In that paper, actually, they introduced a linear optimization model to assess the systemic risk in financial system. But I mean, before that, there are already quite a few many works. I know it's I think it's the economist from France. It's I forgot his name, Jean, whatever. He's the very first one come out with this concept of systemic risk, and also discuss some policies to mitigate. And he won actually, not as the financial crisis. Actually, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. Yeah, essentially for his really, because he's the very first one. He has also the very first monograph talking about the systemic risk. Okay, and then I think it's one is really, he's from Australia, but also worked in federal banks in a couple of countries that who play a very important role using the data from the banks to assess the systemic risk based on the optimization model introduced by Eisenberg and Roy. Okay. So, and they consider here really different scenarios here, and like say, you have cross holdings and you have limited liabilities, and so on and so forth, and using model calorie simulation and some other method. Okay, and very interesting is actually there's also one paper by Anna and Gail, who is they published the paper in 2000. That's long before the financial crisis, right? And the title of the name is Financial Contagious. Okay, so in that paper, they actually introduced the very first network model, which consists of only 4 banks. Okay, and that's how typically they researchers in finance they do. They always start, some model more based on business background, and study really a very small network to see, and when it's really the most stable one, whatever. And the very, very restrictive assumptions that all the banks, they have the same amount of liability, and then in that case, they can associate with that the liability metrics with the adjacent metrics of any graph. Okay. With that perfect matching between the graph modeling and the liability metrics in the financial network, and then they show that actually the complete network is the most resilient one because when the shock is small, but then they also show that actually when the shock is large, then the complete network will become the least resilient one. Okay, while in the network with 2 independent subnetworks will become the most resilient one if the shock is large. Okay. And then there is also another paper by a group of researchers from MIT. He's one of the most active economist. So they published a paper and studied the systemic risk and stability in financial network, where they consider here the shock is discrete. Okay, and then assuming the shock is small and also large. and then and pretty much they just relax the assumption used in the Anna Guess paper and to see, and which kind of network, the system is the least resilient or the least stable one, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then it's also some researcher from California. He has been working with actually another distinguished scholar who also won the Nobel Prize. They also partial paper to study here really the systemic risk in financial networks. Okay, we'll come back to this point a bit later on. And of course, there are still many works. Okay, but due to space here, then I will just skip, and this is just incomplete list. Okay. Now let me describe the linear optimization model introduced by Eisenberg and Noyle. They're also called linear agent model. Okay. So in this model here, they're using PI. The code is really the total liability. Okay. And LIJ is the liability of node I to node J. Okay, so LIJ is sort of, a matrix with non-negative elements, and all the dark elements should be zero because no bank owns any liability to itself. Okay, so PI is the total liability here, and then it's also as alpha I is the asset, which is defined by the cash position, also or operational cash that can be used to pay the liability. You don't have to go to some delivery process. Okay, so that's or somehow they call it liquid asset. So and XI is a decision variable here is defined as the percentage for liability. The financial institute is willing to pay. Okay, so it's 0.5. That means that financial institution is willing to pay or can pay up to 50% of its total liability. Okay, and also assume that this cleaning agent here, and then say, and assume that there's a central agent. They call it that's a cleaning agent will be able to clean up the liabilities in this in the financial network. And also assume that if we say the bank I pays this percentage here, XI, and then that amount would be fairly distributed to, all its, creditors. Okay, so you have to return when you pay that one, then return to all the banks. Okay. Actually, if you look at this problem here, it's a very simple linear optimization model, right? And you may wonder why then what's the problem here, right? And of course here is the O1 vector, okay, which means because describe rather XI describes the percentage of the liability that bank I is willing to pay. Okay, that's why we got this OXI should be between 0 and 1. This is common here in many financial optimization models. Okay, so and then when we solve this, right, the cleaning agent model, this simple linear optimization model, and then you can see this. Well, it may happen here Xi equal 1, then we call it, right, that bank can pay all its debts, right? That then we call it solvent. If you can only pay a certain percent, then sometimes then we call it default, right? Because it can only pay like up to 80% or 50%. And here just notational convenience. Sometimes we say if the problem becomes infeasible, which means you remove that non-negative requirement and solve it, you may end up with some solutions Xi less than 0, and that means that the bank is bankrupted, which means it cannot pay any of its liability unless someone else to help it send a check to the bank. Okay, so let's look at here what's the change in this model. In one side, it's the asset vector, that alpha I in the right-hand side of the linear optimization model, it's always subject to the market shock, right? Because all these financial institutions that do invest in stock market and in startup in all this. So therefore, the cash flow for all the banks that are subject to certain market fluctuation from time to time, and no one really knows precisely what's that cash they have actually. You can estimate on average whatever, but the exact number, no one knows. Okay. Secondly, here it has to do with that liability metrics. Even in theory, in model, we can assume we know this, LIJ, but in practice, no one knows that. And here is the balance sheet here when they, the banks report here, they have to report even that's after the financial crisis here. The SEC required all the banks to report, what's going on, and that's what we submitted to the government here. Okay. What they will show you here really what's the total liability they have. Okay, all the total credit they have. Okay, all the cash position, but not the value of each individual element in that matrix. Okay, let's put it here in this matrix here. So what we will end up here, we have the summation of each row. That's the total liability, PI. Okay, and we also know the summation of each column. That's what we call the credit. Okay, it's called CJ. Okay, and then we know only the summation for each row and each column, but we don't know the value for each individual element. So that's a big challenge. To address this issue here, and then like Essen here, he's the very first one, he introduced it, maybe we can solve some entropy optimization problem to maximize the information gain based on this callback liberal divergence measurements. Okay, it's entropy optimization, and you can really solve it. And unfortunately, here it's that liability matrix computed based on the KL divergence. It's a complete network. Okay, and then when they conduct some theoretical analysis based on that matrix, then they found the contagious risk is very, very low. This has been pointed out in several papers by very, very well-known distinguished scholars in finance. Okay, they all derive the same conclusion, which somehow is kind of awkward. Look at it here, this conclusion from these well-known scholars, right? And then people just, when they say, okay, the contagious risk is very low, but then we have the financial crisis, then people just wonder what's wrong. Okay, or somehow you just like Anna and Gail, and when they try to analyze the contagious risk in the financial network, they either assume the shock is very small, or make some assumptions such that say the liability, the liabilities are evenly distributed among all the creditors of the bank. Okay, which means essentially here that liability metric is always associated with some graph. Okay, and it also means all the banks have the same liability. That's a very, very strong assumption actually never happens in the financial in financial network. Okay, so and that's why I say a few years ago then we started this. Essentially, actually, I started this in the earlier when I was worked in Illinois, and then started to look at the financial crisis and to see, say, how can we identify the least resilient network? Okay, and then also I would like to see here what will be the impact this network structure on the stability of the financial system. That's essentially the purpose of this research. Okay. Now let us look at here the stability of the financial network. Okay, and for that, then we have to assume here we have two financial networks. Okay, we assume they have the same set of assets, say alpha, but they do have two different matrices L1, L2, and these two matrices, they have to satisfy certain constraints, which means the summation for each row and the summation for each column, they have to be equal to each other, okay? And then we say here, if we solve that optimization problem, and we can compare the objective function value here, right? So if the objective function value in one system, say P transpose X star L1 is less than P transpose X star L2, and then we say, the system one is less stable than L2, okay? And then I mentioned here that paper by Caponi from Columbia University. So that considered case in here where actually these two matrices follows certain pattern here. They assume say L1 equal M times L2, where M is some doubly stochastic matrix. But however, if you follow that one, then you will see actually that won't satisfy that the constraint we imposed here on the total liabilities. So essentially here, all this model, the either value some basic rules in finance or made very, very restrictive assumptions on the distribution of the liabilities. Okay, that's why somehow even there are many, many papers published and still people still wonder what's going on. Okay, so and here's the linear optimization model. So in the inner level, we're trying to maximize, okay, so when that liability metric is fixed, okay, and then we're trying to maximize X here, and then we have some uncertain part here, that's delta L, okay, and then we're trying to find what are the part with minimal value here. So it's kind of a bi-level linear optimization problem. And then that uncertain set is defined this way. You have to satisfy certain equality constraints and also some inequality constraints. Okay, because this is simply just based on that, the constraints of the total liabilities and also the credits for all the banks. Okay, so if we use the duality theory in linear optimization problem, then we can rewrite this as minima and minima here. Look at the dual problem like this. Okay, or somehow we can also write like this. Okay, the downside of this problem actually both, right? We have the dual variable is lambda here, and then we have also delta L, which satisfies this, linear constraints. And then the constraints that you see here, that's why you have many, bilinear terms, makes the problem very, very hard to solve. Okay, so and that's how we then we look at here different techniques to solve that, hard optimization model. So I would skip here some of this, and this problem, right? When you try to minimize, say, when number is fixed, right? We try to find how to update the delta L, and then you see this delta L doesn't play any role in the objective function, right? And you look at that one, and you can show that with some proof here. And then we have to be very, very careful here to choose a good objective function in this, when you solve that problem, to ensure that you can always reduce the objective function value after you one update of this delta L. Okay, so that's why we have been trying different schemes how to update L, and if one idea works, okay. If it doesn't work, and what should we do, and so on and so forth. Okay, and you see here, eventually we propose three or four different schemes to deal with different scenarios to ensure that if one idea doesn't work, and then we have another idea, and so on and so forth. And this method here is based on the active asset method in optimization. So essentially, you look at here the set of banks or default banks, which means if you look at the dual solution here, which means that lambda r, all of them should be positive. And then you will see if that's the active set, right? That's a dual constraints, and then look at it. You try to approximate by using a linear equation system, okay? And you solved a very complicated process here, and you have to prove a lot of theory and why this is working and why not. Okay, so I will just skip over this. Okay, it's a very lengthy paper. Even sometimes myself I hate to read that paper. And that's also our paper really had struggled because it seems no reviewer really liked that paper because it's too technical from the methodology perspective. Okay. And this is the overall, the flow chart of the algorithm. And as you can see, very complicated because it had to show, when one algorithm doesn't work and then how you jump from one to another one and so on and so forth. Okay, back and forth a few times. Now let us look at how the network structure in this case. Okay, and then you will see we define sort of the data loop. Keep in mind we require the summation for each row equal 0, and each column equal 0, right? The summation to update the delta L. Okay, and that's corresponding to this like this, got plus delta and minus delta in some row and something like this. Okay, which is really very nice structure here. And then we observe that there's a trigger here. So if the auction stops, even we don't know whether the solution is globally optimal, but we can really get some local optimality condition. Okay, that's the interesting part. We are really not sure whether the solution we found is optimal, but we still have some local optimality condition for that problem, which says here there shouldn't be any loop in that one. Okay, so what it means, we look at here, all the positive elements in that liability matrix, and we try to link all the elements with positive values, okay, in the same row or same column, okay. And then this condition simply implies there's no cycle in that induced graph. This is not even the original network anymore. So if you look at it, then we have a proof here, say if we have the liability matrix, you have k positive elements for say bank 1, and then you can rearrange all this, right, and put them just say 2 to k and as positive elements. If that liability matrix is symmetric, and then you got the first column also positive value, and then you look at the submatrix, and then you can show that actually all the other elements have to be 0. Okay, you can show that's a very, very strong property there. Okay, but then we can somehow just look at some special cases here where you actually, what do we call it, you end up with some tri-diagonal matrix where it's only, off diagonal, say R and R plus 1 and also R minus 1 are non-negative. Okay, all the are zeros. Okay, and then we show that, so if this is the case in here, and then we assume that it's a monopoly node here, that's the case actually we identified in our first paper in this direction, which studied the vulnerability of financial network. And then we show that, this monopoly node is the one whose asset equals the total asset in the network. Essentially, so there is a monopoly in the network control all the assets. Okay, and all those you will have just 0 assets. And if this is the case, and then, okay, if that monopoly node fails, then all the nodes in the system will fail. Okay, that's simply called too big to fail. Okay, in finance, they call it. Okay, and then we also prove that, so if this network follows that tri-diagonal structure here, and then you can show that actually the failure of any node in that network will cause all the nodes following it to fail. Okay, which means somehow even you save the bigger banks, you still cannot avoid the dominant effect, the cascading failure in the system, if the asset is really poorly distributed. Okay, well, this is a very, very interesting theoretical result. We actually checked the asset before the financial crisis. Okay, in the United States at that time, we have about 2,800 banks in the country. The top 5 banks, the total asset owned by this top 5 banks is about 90%. What that means, okay? You don't have a single monopoly node in the system, but essentially the 5 biggest banks in the country, they own about 90% of the assets. Okay, all other, 2,800 banks, they own almost less than 10% of the assets. But that's why during the financial crisis, even the federal government bail out all these big banks. Okay, still there are about 1/4 of the banks bankrupted in 2 years. Okay, so this is really, as far as I know, this is the very first result. We, at least provide a partial interpretation to what happens. Okay, now let us look at here the numeric evidence here. So we have the model for the worst case, and then of course you can also change slightly the model to find the best case, and then we have the model based on the KL, divergence matrix. Okay. So in this model here, we use random shocks to see, if this happens here, how many banks will default. Okay, then you can see the worst case is always the worst. They're going to move banks default. And also on the right-hand side, we look at here the number of banks bankrupted. Okay, and then you will see in this case, essentially for the best case and also the KL divergence matrix, there is essentially no bank bankrupted. But however, for the worst case, and they do appear in a few cases in our testing. And then we also look at the solution from the dual problem. Okay, and then we have, check here the asset vector here we define here. This is we're taking from the same reference. And we just want to see what's the contagious factor. That's lambda, the solution to the dual problem. And then you can see if we use that liability matrix based on KL divergence matrix, then you see that the dual solution, they have very small values, which means that contagious risk is very, very low. But however, in the worst case, you see that number jumped to number one is 36.58, and the second one, even you have more assets here, that factor turns out to be close to 50. What that means is, in the worst case, the real contagious risk is almost 20 or 30 times higher than what analyzed in the literature. Okay, and you can also see here the difference in the best case. Essentially, they're very close to the what analyzed in the literature. So what it means, essentially, a lot of this analysis really cannot, that's why they cannot explain what happened during the financial crisis. And then we also look at it here, in the shock with random shock in multi-periods here. And then we take the same, liability matrix based on KL divergence matrix. And then we look at it here to see what's that risk here measured by the objective function value here, and then you can see that the loss. Okay, so and as you can see from this figure here, the loss in the worst case is much higher than the best case and also the KL metrics. So it's again similar observation here. We can draw the conclusion that actually what analyzed in the current literature is very close to the best case, which really cannot explain what happened. Okay, so and to summarize here, what we have done is we develop a new model and also a few techniques here to identify the most vulnerable network. Okay, and also provide some graphic characterization of the network. Okay, we demonstrated using theoretical proof that there is a significant dominant effect. Even the monopoly node is safe, is liability free. Okay, too big to fail is okay, but saving the bigger bank still cannot help this. Okay, and also we conduct the numeric experiment to show that there is very, very high contagious risk in the identified network. Okay, this is very different from what the conclusions already in several existing works in the literature here. Okay, Look at the future direction here. We're still thinking, the vulnerability with the financial network, given the whole liquidation process. But also look at here the resilience of the financial network, and the new regulations. That's because after the financial crisis in 2007, 2008, Basel III, that's a commission, Euro Commission, they implement the different policies to improve the resilience of the financial network. So somehow there's some research should be done in that direction. But also look at here new ways to stabilize the financial network. Okay, I think I made already a bit over time. Sorry for that. Okay, so that's all. And here just some references. And our paper is already published. The first paper published in Management Science, and also in 2018. And myself and Professor John Birch, we gave a tutorial on this optimization model and technique for systemic risk assessment and control in the Inform's annual meeting. So there you may find some other references in this direction. Okay, thank you.